The awakened ones walk among us with eyes that seem to be looking at something the rest of us cannot see. They carry a peculiar burden, the weight of seeing through the grand illusion that most of humanity mistakes for reality. Their smiles often hide a profound sadness, not for themselves, but for the unnecessary suffering they witness all around. Consider this. What if enlightenment is not what the spiritual marketplaces have promised you? What if instead of bliss and belonging, it delivers you to a stark precipice of aloneness that few can bear to stand upon? The truth is, most who glimpse real awakening retreat back into comfortable dreams rather than face what lies beyond the veil. I've watched countless seekers approach the threshold of genuine realization only to turn away at the last moment, clutching desperately at their familiar suffering rather than surrender to the dissolution that awaits. For to truly awaken is to die while still alive, to witness the complete unraveling of everything you believed yourself to be. This is the bitter solitude that few survive, the recognition that the self you've spent your entire life protecting, improving, and identifying with simply does not exist. And in that terrifying freedom, you stand utterly alone with no one left to even experience the solitude. Isn't it fascinating how earnestly we chase after enlightenment? Like a dog chasing its tail, around and around we go, reading spiritual books, attending retreats, meditating for hours, all in pursuit of that elusive moment of awakening. We imagine it as a kind of graduation ceremony, where we'll finally be handed our cosmic diploma and welcomed into the club of the illuminated. But I want to suggest something rather startling. What if this very seeking, this desperate spiritual ambition, is precisely the thing preventing you from seeing what's already here? You see, seeking creates a peculiar kind of blindness. It establishes the seeker, you, as separate from that which is sought, awakening. And this separation is the fundamental illusion. It's as if you're searching the entire house for your eyeglasses while wearing them the whole time. The Buddha had a delightful term for this predicament. He called it spiritual materialism, the accumulation of spiritual experiences as if they were possessions. I've meditated for 10,000 hours. I've studied with 17 different masters. I once had a Kundalini awakening that lasted for 3 days. All the while, the real awakening patiently waits, not at the end of some spiritual marathon, but in the immediate abandonment of seeking itself. And herein lies the first bitter pill of awakening. The moment you truly wake up, you realize you've been sleepwalking. Not despite your spiritual practices, but often because of them. You've been sustaining the very illusion of separation you sought to transcend. The first people to walk away from the possibility of true awakening are the professional seekers, because they have the most to lose. Their entire identity, carefully constructed around being spiritual, dissolves like a sandcastle at high tide. And what could be more terrifying than that? So ask yourself this. What if you stopped seeking right now? What if you abandoned every technique, every practice, every hope of future enlightenment? What would remain? Who would remain? Perhaps in that sudden stopping, in that radical surrender of the spiritual ego, you might catch a glimpse of what has been here all along, the awakening that was never absent, only overlooked in your furious quest to find it. But I must warn you, this is merely the threshold of our exploration, because what happens when the seeker dissolves is far more unsettling than most spiritual enthusiasts are prepared to face. There's a reason why every genuine spiritual tradition speaks of dying before you die. The Sufis call it fana no annihilation. The Christians speak of being crucified with Christ. The Hindus talk about the dissolution of the ego. But these poetic metaphors often fail to convey the raw existential terror of the experience itself. You see, when awakening truly begins to dawn, not as a concept or a pleasant altered state, but as the fundamental reality, it feels precisely like dying, and not in some romanticized, peaceful way. No, it's more like being torn apart atom by atom, watching helplessly as everything you believed yourself to be is revealed as fiction. I remember a Zen story about a monk who approached his master and proudly declared, "I have been studying with you for 3 years, and I think I'm beginning to understand." The master replied, "If you really understood, you would kill yourself immediately." Shocking, isn't it? But there's a profound truth here. The master wasn't suggesting literal suicide. He was pointing to the necessity of ego death, which feels no less threatening to the separate self. When you stand at the edge of true awakening, you're standing at the precipice of your own annihilation. Not the annihilation of your body or your awareness, but of everything you've taken yourself to be. Your history, your personality, your cherished beliefs, your spiritual accomplishments, your wounds, your victories, all of it revealed as an elaborate story with no storyteller. And here's where so many turn back. They approach this edge, feel the vertigo of non-existence, and retreat into the familiar comfort of their separate identity. Surely this can't be right, they tell themselves. Enlightenment must be blissful, not terrifying. I must be on the wrong track. But what if this terror is the gateway? What if this feeling of dying is precisely what the mystics have been pointing to all along? The price of admission to reality as it actually is. You know, there's a wonderful Zen saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. But they leave out the middle part, don't they? During enlightenment, during this death and rebirth, there is no one to chop wood, no one to carry water, no wood, no water, no before, no after. Just the shattering of every reference point that once oriented your existence. Few survive this phase because few are willing to be absolutely nobody, to die completely to themselves and discover what remains. But for those who do, for those rare beings who surrender completely to this death, something miraculous awaits on the other side, not a better version of their old self, but something far more extraordinary and far more simple. The question is, are you willing to die before you die? Or will you, like so many before you, turn back at the moment of truth, choosing the familiar prison of selfhood over the terrifying freedom of awakening? Perhaps the most devastating revelation of awakening is this: the self you've been protecting, improving, and identifying with your entire life simply doesn't exist. Not in the way you thought, not as an enduring entity, not as a real thing at all. Imagine spending your life savings to build the perfect home, only to discover upon completion that there's no one to live in it. That's the bizarre predicament of awakening. You've spent decades constructing this elaborate identity, your preferences, your history, your spiritual attainments, your wounds and triumphs, only to discover there's no one home. There never was. You see, most of us live with the tacit assumption that inside this body-mind is a kind of control center, a little homunculus sitting behind the eyes, experiencing life and making decisions. The real me, we might call it. But when awakening strips away all illusions, this central self is nowhere to be found. Oh, there's consciousness, there's awareness, there's the play of experience, but there's no experiencer separate from the experience. There's no thinker of thoughts. There's no feeler of feelings. There's just what's happening. And this realization creates a kind of cosmic homelessness. You can no longer take refuge in being somebody. All the familiar strategies for maintaining your self-image collapse. The very questions that once seemed so important, who am I? What should I do with my life? How can I become better? Are revealed as meaningless because they presuppose an I that simply isn't there. I remember a professor of Oriental philosophy who came to me once deeply troubled. He had studied the doctrine of no self for years, written books about it, taught it to students. Then one day during meditation, he actually experienced it, and he was terrified. Alan, he said to me, if there's no self, then who's having this experience? Who's meditating? Who's teaching? Who's living my life? I simply smiled and replied, who wants to know? You see, this is where intellectual understanding fails us completely. You can study non-duality for decades without ever facing the existential vertigo of actually realizing you don't exist as a separate entity. It's the difference between reading about swimming and being thrown into the deep end of the pool. And this is precisely why so few people sustain awakening. They approach the gateless gate, peek through, glimpse the void where they expected to find themselves, and recoil in horror. They quickly reconstruct the familiar walls of selfhood and retreat into the comfortable fiction of being someone. But what if you didn't turn away? What if you allowed yourself to dissolve completely into this groundless ground? What if you accepted that there's no one to come home to? And in that very acceptance discovered you are already home as the boundless awareness in which all experience arises and subsides. The loneliness of awakening isn't about being separated from others. It's about being separated from the illusory self that you always assumed was you. And yet, paradoxically, only in that separation is true intimacy with all existence possible. And then, just when you think awakening couldn't possibly be more devastating, something unexpected happens. You start to laugh. Not the nervous laughter of discomfort, but the deep, belly-shaking laughter of seeing the cosmic joke that's been playing out all along. You realize that you, this phantom self, have spent your entire life running away from a tiger that doesn't exist, only to discover that you don't exist either. And suddenly it's hilarious, the most uproarious joke ever told. And you've been both the comedian and the audience without knowing it. The spiritual marketplace promised you enlightenment as the ultimate achievement, the gold medal at the end of the spiritual Olympics. But what you found instead was that there's no finish line because there was never any race to begin with, no one to become enlightened and nothing to attain. Just this. Just what is the ordinary suchness of existence that was never hidden, only overlooked. In your desperate search for something special, I'm reminded of the Zen master Gute, who, whenever asked about the deepest meaning of Buddhism, would simply raise one finger. That was his entire teaching. He had a young attendant who, seeing the reverence that this gesture inspired, began to imitate the master. Whenever visitors would ask the boy about his master's teaching, he too would raise one finger. When Gute heard about this, he called the boy to him. When the boy appeared, Gute asked him, "Do you understand my teaching?" The boy raised his finger. Gut promptly cut it off with a knife. As the boy ran away, screaming in pain, Gut called after him. The boy turned and Gute raised his finger. In that moment, the boy was enlightened. Now, this may seem like a rather extreme pedagogical method, but the point is profound. The boy was imitating the form without realizing the emptiness it pointed to. He was collecting spiritual trinkets rather than dying to himself. Only in the shock of losing both his finger and his composure did he suddenly see through the charade. And this is the cosmic joke of awakening. What you've been seeking so desperately is what you already are. The treasure was buried in your own backyard all along. But you couldn't see it because you were too busy looking everywhere else, accumulating teachings, techniques, and experiences like a hamster collecting bedding. Yet few can bear this humor, to realize that your entire spiritual quest was unnecessary, that awakening isn't found at the end of a long journey, but in the immediate recognition of what already is too humiliating for the ego to bear. It means that all your spiritual striving, all your earnest seeking, all your accumulated wisdom was just another form of ignorance. But if you can laugh at this divine comedy, if you can see the absurdity of a self that never existed, desperately trying to find what was never lost, then you've understood something essential. The gateless gate swings open and you walk through without taking a single step. The question is, can you bear the cosmic joke when you are both its punchline and its only audience? Have you ever had a dream so vivid, so convincing that upon waking you lay in bed disoriented, unsure for a moment which reality was real? Now imagine that instead of gradually reorienting to waking life, you suddenly realize that what you thought was waking life was itself just another dream. And not just any dream, but one in which everyone around you is still deeply asleep, convinced that the dream is reality. This is the peculiar isolation of the awakened. You've glimpsed behind the curtain of conventional reality. You've seen that what most people take to be solid, separate things, including themselves, are more like ripples on the surface of a vast ocean of consciousness. But how do you communicate this to someone who has never left the shoreline? I'm reminded of Plato's allegory of the cave, where prisoners are chained facing a wall their entire lives, watching shadows cast by a fire behind them, believing these shadows to be reality itself. Imagine one prisoner is somehow freed and ventures outside the cave, seeing the sun and the world as it truly is for the first time. When he returns to tell the others what he's discovered, they think he's gone mad. His eyes, accustomed now to sunlight, can barely make out the shadows they're all so invested in. They mock him, pity him, or worse. This is why awakening creates a profound kind of loneliness. Not because you're physically separated from others, but because you're operating from a fundamentally different perception of reality. The very ground that most people stand on, the assumption of being a separate self in a world of separate objects, has dissolved for you. But try explaining that at a dinner party. When someone asks, "How are you?" the honest answer might be, "There is no you to be anyway at all." Just this boundless awareness in which the question and the apparent answer are both arise. But say that and watch how quickly the conversation turns to the weather. I once met a Zen master who, after his awakening, didn't speak for 7 years. Not because he took a vow of silence, but because he literally couldn't find words for what he had realized. Language itself, built as it is on subject-object distinctions, seemed like a crude instrument for pointing to a reality where such distinctions dissolve. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. When he finally did speak again, his teachings were famously cryptic and paradoxical, not out of some spiritual affectation, but because paradox was the closest he could come to expressing the inexpressible. He'd say things like, "Open your mouth, already a mistake," or, "The true person of no rank is neither inside nor outside the body." His students would tie themselves in knots trying to understand intellectually what could only be realized experientially. This is another reason why so few sustain awakening. The isolation becomes unbearable. You're seeing in color while everyone around you insists the world is black and white. After a while, it's tempting to pretend you see in black and white too, just to have some company, to rejoin the collective dream, even knowing it's a dream, rather than face the solitude of seeing what others don't. But what if this very isolation is itself part of the dream? What if the sense of being the awakened one among the sleeping masses is just a subtler form of the same illusion of separation? What if true awakening includes the realization that there is no one to be isolated, no one to be lonely, and no one separate from the very people who seem so lost in the dream? This is the paradox within the paradox, to be both utterly alone and completely inseparable from all existence. Can you bear this contradiction without resolving it? Can you stand in this gateless gate without stepping through? Less than #0. 5 hash is greater than there's a delightful Zen saying, "The finger pointing to the moon is not the moon." And yet how easily we mistake the finger for what it points to, especially when it comes to awakening. Language is a marvelous tool for navigating the relative world. It helps us build bridges, write symphonies, and order takeout. But when it comes to expressing the absolute, words become not just inadequate, but actively misleading. They divide what cannot be divided. They solidify what is fluid. They create boundaries where none exist. Consider the word enlightenment itself. The moment we name it, we've already misrepresented it. We've turned it into an object, a possession, a state to be achieved by someone. But genuine awakening is precisely the realization that there is no someone to possess anything. It's the falling away of the very framework within which such acquisitions make sense. I remember a student who came to me exasperated after years of meditation practice. "I've read all the books," he said. "I've sat with masters. I've had profound experiences, but still I don't get it. What exactly is enlightenment?" I asked him, "What exactly is the taste of strawberry jam?" He looked confused. "Well, it's sweet, a bit tart." "No," I interrupted, "not a description of it. What is the actual taste itself?" He fell silent, finally understanding my point. You can't convey the direct experience of strawberry jam through words. No matter how eloquent, someone who has never tasted it cannot know its flavor through language alone. They must taste it themselves. And so it is with awakening. All these words, all my words, are at best a menu, not the meal. At worst, they're additional barriers, more conceptual clutter, obscuring the simple truth that's already here. This is why the great sages often resorted to silence or poetry or deliberate paradox, not to be cryptic or mysterious, but because straightforward language reinforces the very illusions that awakening dispels. Take the Heart Sutra's famous line, "Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form." Logically, this is nonsense. It's like saying black is white, white is black. But it's pointing to a reality beyond the conceptual mind's dualistic categories. where the apparent solidity of things and their essential emptiness are not two separate realities, but two aspects of the same reality. Or consider Joshua's response when asked if a dog has Buddha nature. Sometimes he said yes, sometimes no, to the exact same question. Not because he was confused or inconsistent, but because he understood that any fixed answer would miss the living truth which transcends our categories of yes and no. And this is yet another reason why so few sustain awakening. The conceptual mind, which has been in charge for so long, fights desperately for its dominance. It demands explanations, frameworks, maps of the territory. It collects spiritual concepts like trophies. And each concept, each explanation, each spiritual map becomes another veil between you and the immediate reality that awakening reveals. The spiritual marketplace is filled with words about awakening, mountains of books, countless talks, endless discussions. And ironically, this abundance of words often becomes the very prison that prevents genuine seeing. But what if you put down all concepts, all spiritual language, all attempts to grasp awakening with the mind? What if instead of trying to understand it, you simply look directly at what is? Not through the lens of any teaching or tradition, but with the naked awareness that you already are. This direct looking, free from the mediation of words and concepts, is the gateless gate. It requires no special language, no spiritual attainment, no transcendent state, just this, just the ordinary miracle of existence which was never hidden, only overlooked in your search for something extraordinary. Now we come to perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of awakening. The realization that has been described as ultimate freedom, liberation from the prison of the separate self, turns out to be, for many, utterly unbearable. Why? Because with great freedom comes great responsibility. When you realize that there is no separate self being pushed around by external forces, no victim of circumstances, no one to blame, then suddenly there are no more excuses. There is just the naked fact of your complete responsibility for your experience. You see, most of us live in a peculiar state of complaint. We don't like our jobs, but we blame the economy. We're unhappy in our relationships, but we blame our partners. We feel anxious or depressed, but we blame our brain chemistry. This constant deflection of responsibility is actually quite comforting. It allows us to be perpetual victims, forever at the mercy of forces beyond our control. But awakening strips away this comfort completely. You suddenly see that what you've been calling my life is not something happening to you, it is you happening. The entire drama, with all its suffering and joy, is not being imposed from outside, but is arising from the very ground of your being. I'm reminded of the Hindu concept of Lila, the divine play. From this perspective, what we call reality is God playing hide and seek with himself. Consciousness taking on countless forms and pretending to be separate, distinct entities, all for the sheer joy of the game. But in awakening, the game is up. You've peeked behind your own mask and seen that you are both the player and the playground, both the seeker and the sought. This is a dizzying freedom. There's nowhere to hide, no one to blame, nothing to hold on to. You are the author of your experience, the creator of your world, not in some new age manifesting a posse, but in the much more profound sense that the perceiver and the perceived arise together, mutually creating each other moment by moment. This is why Sartre said, man is condemned to be free. Condemned. What a fascinating choice of words for something we usually celebrate. But he understood that true freedom is not just the removal of external constraints. It's the removal of all excuses, all justifications, all the little stories we tell ourselves about why things are the way they are. I once asked a Zen master what was the most difficult aspect of his awakening. He replied, learning to live without problems. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he was deadly serious. All my life, he said, I defined myself by the problems I was solving, the challenges I was facing, the suffering I was enduring. When I realized there were never any real problems, just situations to be responded to, I felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines. What was my purpose without problems to solve? Who was I without my suffering? This is another threshold where many turn back from awakening. They glimpse this radical freedom, this total responsibility, and it simply feels too exposed, too vulnerable, too much. They prefer the familiar confinement of their victimhood, their complaints, their comforting stories about why they can't be fully alive. But what if you didn't turn away? What if you embraced this unbearable freedom completely? What if you accepted that there is nowhere to hide and nothing to hide from? That you are both the creator and the creation, both the wave and the ocean. This acceptance doesn't mean you'll never feel pain or face challenges, doesn't mean you'll manifest your wildest dreams through positive thinking. It means something far more profound, that whatever arises, pleasure or pain, success or failure, joy or sorrow, you recognize it as the inevitable expression of the freedom that you are. You are free, unbearably, gloriously, terrifyingly free. Can you bear it? Here we come to the most perplexing paradox of awakening. The extraordinary is found only through the most ordinary. The sacred only through the profoundly mundane. The cosmic only through the everyday. There's a famous exchange between a monk and Zen master Zhao Zhou. The monk asked, "What is the meaning of the Bodhidharmas coming from the West?" This was a fancy way of asking, what is the essential teaching of Zen? Zhao Zhou replied, "The cypress tree in the courtyard." What an utterly baffling response. The monk is asking about the profound wisdom brought by the founder of Zen from India to China. Surely one of the most significant transmissions of spiritual insight in history. And Zhao Zhou points to a common tree that the monk probably walked past every day without a second glance. But this is precisely the point. The awakened state isn't found in some exotic dimension beyond ordinary experience. It's found in the cypress tree, in the cup of tea, in the sound of the rain, in the sensation of your breath right now, not as objects to be observed by a separate self, but as expressions of the very awareness in which they appear. The great Zen master Dogen put it beautifully. If you cannot find the truth right where you are, where else do you expect to find it? This is why so many spiritual seekers miss it. They're looking for some spectacular experience, some earth-shattering revelation, some permanent altered state that will finally convince them they've got it. Meanwhile, awakening is hiding in plain sight in the ordinary mind that's reading these words right now. I remember a woman who came to one of my talks deeply frustrated with her meditation practice. "I've been at this for years," she said, "and I still haven't had any special experiences. No bliss, no lights, no oneness with the universe. Just sitting there watching my boring breath and my neurotic thoughts. I must be doing something wrong." "On the contrary," I told her, "you're doing something very right. You're seeing things exactly as they are. There's nothing more to get. This is it." She looked crestfallen. "But surely there must be more than this. Some deeper state, some higher consciousness." "The deepest state," I replied, "is this very moment experienced without the usual filters and interpretation. The highest consciousness is what's aware of your disappointment right now." She left unsatisfied, still convinced that real awakening must be something far more exotic than this ordinary awareness. And in doing so, she turned away from the very gateway she'd been seeking. You see, the essential nature of mind, what the Zen masters call ordinary mind, isn't some special state to be achieved through arduous practice. It's what's already here, always already the case, simply overlooked in our search for something different, something better, something more spiritual. This is why the Zen tradition speaks of awakening as seeing your original face before you were born, not acquiring something new, but recognizing what's primordially present, not adding some spiritual dimension to your experience, but removing the conceptual filters that make the ordinary appear less than sacred. But here's the rub. The ordinary is both the easiest and the hardest place to look. Easiest because it's right here, requiring no special effort or journey. Hardest because its very familiarity makes it invisible. Like fish who don't notice the water they swim in, we don't notice the awareness that we are. And this is yet another reason why so few sustain awakening. It's too ordinary, too simple, too disappointing to the spiritual ego that craves specialness. Surely this can't be it, the mind protests. There must be more than this. Plain everyday consciousness. But what if this ordinary mind, this everyday awareness, is actually the extraordinary treasure you've been seeking all along? What if the cypress tree in the courtyard really is the answer to the ultimate question? What if the sacred isn't somewhere else, but right here, disguised as the profane? Have you ever considered that the entire spiritual quest might be the most elaborate game of solitaire ever devised? A game in which you are both the player and the cards, both the seeker and the sought. There's a Hindu concept called Leela that I find particularly illuminating here. Leela means divine play. The idea that all of existence is God playing hide and seek with himself, consciousness fragmenting into countless forms and then pretending to be separate, all for the sheer joy of rediscovering its own unity. But here's the twist in this cosmic game. When awakening occurs, you realize that there never was anyone else playing. There never was a separate you apart from the totality. The seeker and the sought were one and the same all along. You've been chasing your own tail in an elaborate charade of hiddenness and discovery. This realization brings a peculiar kind of existential loneliness. Not the loneliness of separation, but the loneliness of being all there is. The loneliness of the one without a second. I'm reminded of a Sufi story about a fish who was searching for the ocean. He swam frantically from one current to another, asking every creature he met, "Where can I find this ocean I've heard so much about?" Some laughed at him, others tried to give him directions, but nothing satisfied his longing. Finally, exhausted and desperate, he met a wise old turtle who said, "My friend, you're in the ocean now. You've always been in the ocean. The ocean is what you are and where you are and what surrounds you. Your very search for it is taking place within it. Like that fish, we search everywhere for what we already are. We look for love, connection, meaning, purpose, never realizing that the very awareness in which this search takes place is itself what we seek. The ocean looking for water. And when this is seen, really seen, not just understood intellectually, there's a profound aloneness. Not because you're separated from others, but because you realize there are no others in the way you thought. There's just this one seamless reality playing all the parts. The awakened ones throughout history have spoken of this in different ways. Jesus said, "I and the Father are one." The Upanishads declare Tattivam Asi, thou art that. The Buddha spoke of the emptiness of all phenomena. Different languages pointing to the same recognition. There is no separate self to be either connected or disconnected. There is only this boundless awareness appearing as everything. But the mind recoils from this recognition. It's too vast, too exposed, too lonely. We prefer the illusion of separation with all its drama and suffering to this stark aloneness of being all there is. At least in separation we have the comfort of others. Even if those others cause us pain, at least they confirm our existence as separate entities. This is why so many who glimpse awakening retreat from it. They catch sight of this cosmic aloneness and rush back into the familiar confinement of a separate identity. This can't be right, they tell themselves. Surely awakening should feel more connected, more loving, more together with everything. But what if true connection can only happen when the illusion of separation is seen through completely? What if real love is only possible when there's no separate lover and beloved, but just love itself flowing without obstruction? What if the ultimate togetherness requires the surrender of the very notion of separate entities coming together? I often think of the Zen image of the 10,000 bamboo shoots after a spring rain. Above ground, they appear as separate stalks, distinct entities growing apart from each other. But beneath the soil, they are all expressions of a single rhizome system, interconnected in ways invisible to the eye. Their apparent separation is just that, an appearance, a play of form that doesn't negate their underlying unity. So it is with us. Our apparent separation is the play of form, the dance of manifestation. But beneath the surface, or rather as the very ground of our being, we are expressions of a single awareness, a unified field of consciousness playing all the parts in this divine game. Can you bear this cosmic aloneness? Can you recognize yourself as both the player and the played, both the seeker and the sought, both the question and the answer? Or will you, like so many before you, retreat into the comforting illusion of being a separate someone in search of connection with other separate someones? This is perhaps the ultimate test of awakening. Not how blissful it feels, not how peaceful it makes you, not what powers it confers, but whether you can bear to be the only player in a game that was only ever played by one. Now we come to the most beautiful paradox of all. The very aloneness that seems so unbearable, so stark, so terrifying to the separate self becomes, when fully embraced, the gateway to a connection far more profound than anything the ego could imagine. You see, what we've been calling loneliness or isolation or solitude are actually experiences of the separate self. They presuppose a me that is disconnected from others, a fragment that longs to be rejoined with the whole. But in true awakening, this very framework dissolves. There is no separate self to be lonely. There are no others to be connected with or disconnected from. There is just this boundless awareness, appearing as everything, as the birds singing outside your window, as the thoughts arising in your mind, as the sensation of your breath, as the people you meet, as the entire cosmos in all its glory. When this is not just understood but realized, when it becomes your living reality rather than a nice spiritual concept, something miraculous happens. The very world that seemed outside you, separate from you, is recognized as an expression of what you are. Not what you have or what you know, but what you are. I'm reminded of the Zen story of Huineng, the sixth patriarch. Before his awakening, he was an illiterate woodcutter who happened to hear someone reciting the Diamond Sutra and was immediately struck to the core. He traveled to the monastery where the fifth patriarch resided, hoping to study with him. Because of his lack of education, he was assigned to work in the kitchen, hauling rice. For 8 months, he performed this menial task, while the more educated monks studied directly with the master. Then the fifth patriarch announced a poetry contest to determine his successor. The head monk Shengxiu wrote, "The body is the Bodhi tree. The mind is like a clear mirror standing. Take care to wipe it all the time. Allow no dust to cling." This was considered profound by the other monks. But Huineng, upon hearing this verse, asked someone to write his response on the wall beside it. Bodhi originally has no tree. The clear mirror has no stand. Originally there is not a single thing. Where can dust cling? The fifth patriarch recognized the depth of Huineng's realization and secretly transmitted the robe and bowl of succession to him, telling him to flee the monastery to avoid the jealousy of the other monks. What's fascinating about this story isn't just Huineng's profound insight, but what happened afterward. Having been recognized as fully awakened, having received the highest honor in his tradition, he spent the next 15 years hiding out among hunters, living an ordinary life, chopping wood, and carrying water, not because he was afraid, but because he recognized that awakening isn't a status to be claimed or a position to be defended. It's just the natural state expressed most fully in the ordinary activities of everyday life. And this brings us to the great resolution of the apparent loneliness of awakening. When the separate self dissolves completely, what remains isn't isolation, but intimacy, an intimacy with all existence that was impossible as long as you maintained the illusion of being a separate entity. You discover that you were never alone, could never be alone, because what you are is not a thing separate from other things, but the very awareness in which all things arise, the player of all the parts, the dreamer of all the dreams, the single actor behind all the masks. And from this recognition comes a love unlike anything the separate self could experience. Not a love that reaches across a gap between subject and object, but a love that recognizes no gap at all. A love that doesn't say, "I love you," as if there were two, but simply loves as its very nature, as the sun simply shines. This is the gift hidden within the bitter solitude of awakening. Having died to yourself completely, having faced the stark aloneness of being all there is, you are reborn into a world where everything is an expression of your own being. Not the small self with its preferences and aversions, but the boundless awareness that you always already are. The Sufis call this state baka after fana, subsistence after annihilation. Having passed through the complete dissolution of the separate self, you return to the world of form, but now recognizing it as your own face, your own expression, your own dance. And this perhaps is why so few survive real awakening. not because it's difficult to attain, but because it requires the courage to die before you die, to face the abyss of non-existence, to endure the bitter solitude that precedes the recognition that you were never alone at all. The question is not whether you can attain awakening. The question is whether you can bear the death that is its threshold and the rebirth that is its fulfillment. Whether you can endure being no one in order to be everyone. Whether you can embrace the bitter solitude that dissolves into the sweetest connection imaginable. This is the invitation that life extends to you in every moment. Not in some future state, not as a result of decades of practice, but right here, right now, in the simple recognition of what you already are, the ever-present awareness that is reading these words, that is feeling these sensations, that is the very aliveness of this moment. You are that. You have always been that. And in the recognition of that simple truth lies the end of seeking, the end of separation, the end of the bitter solitude that seems so unbearable, and the beginning of a love affair with existence that has no end.